The Biocorredor Amazónico is going to invest 416 million in the next 17 years. And it's the first one located in terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. So
if we are not funding indigenous-led conservation, we are missing one of the most cost-effective, resilient, and culturally grounded climate solutions that we have.
So we really need a reform of the financial mechanisms so we can really have this flow going directly to indigenous peoples.
Hey everyone, we are excited to launch a new podcast series in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, The Road to COP30. Throughout September, we'll be speaking with leaders from the Nature Conservancy across Latin America to explore their work ahead of COP30, taking place this November in Pará State, Brazil. On episode 5, we sit down with 3 leaders from the Nature Conservancy: Galo Medina, Program Director for Ecuador; Fernanda Bortolotto, Climate Policy Specialist; and Carolina Polania, Community-Based Conservation Specialist. Indigenous peoples steward 80% of the world's biodiversity, yet receive less than 1% of climate-related funding, even as $7 trillion in harmful subsidies drive deforestation and threaten their territories. Throughout this conversation, we learn that direct funding, equitable frameworks like REDD+, and recognition of land rights are crucial to ensuring just and cost-effective climate solutions, as shown through lessons from Brazil's Mato Grosso's programs. Building on that, Ecuador's Amazon Biocorridor program offers a groundbreaking example of what's possible through debt for nature swaps, unlocking conservation finance while placing indigenous peoples at the center of governance. Join us to explore how equitable climate finance can transform the future of the Amazon and set a model for the world.
Today, we're going to really be focusing in on indigenous peoples and how we provide access to climate financing to indigenous peoples. Thank you both for joining us. First, I will ask Catalina, can you share a little bit about your background and your role with the Nature Conservancy?
Okay, thank you, Preston. I'm so happy to be here with you today. I am biologist from the National University in Colombia. I have a master's degree in conservation of biodiversity from CATIE in Costa Rica, and I've been working with TNC since almost 13 years ago. I have been working in the Amazon and other places of Colombia, and since 5 years ago, I am working as a community-based conservation specialist. I am in charge to manage the projects that we developed in Caquetá region. Caquetá is one of the areas of the Colombian Amazon, and we have developing different actions with indigenous people and local community. Our job have very strong focus in recognize the gender focus, the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice focus, working with these important stakeholders of the of our landscapes.
Well, thank you so much for being here and joining us on the call today. And then, Fernanda, if you want to talk a little bit about your background as well as your role with the Nature Conservancy.
Sure, Preston. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here with you and with Caro. I don't think we we met in person, but it's always good to know the colleagues that are working in the same role that you are. I'm a forestry engineer from the University of State of São Paulo here in Brazil, and with a master degree in sustainable development, with my project regarding the participation of indigenous peoples at climate conference. I'm working at TNC for 2 years as climate policy specialist, looking for all the national policies and how they are connected with the global policies and local projects of TNC. And for the last 10 years, I have been working with indigenous organizations, the political organizations of indigenous people in Brazil, as their international advisor, and working with them with climate changes policy incidents. So since 2014, I follow the indigenous peoples at the climate conference, follow their incidents in the national climate policies, and also their demands for direct finance mechanisms.
And I also want to introduce Galo Medina, who is the program director for Ecuador for the Nature Conservancy. He is going to join us along with Fernanda and Catalina to really dive into the Amazon Biocorridor program, as well as this huge project and this huge program, which is Ecuador's Green Bonds program, which I think ties directly with the Nature Conservancy's Nature Bonds program. So,
hi, thank you, Preston. Thank you for the invitation. Of course, my name is Galo Medina. I'm the director of TNC in Ecuador. I'm a biologist working with biodiversity conservation all my life, with many ecosystems here in Ecuador and in the region. And since I am working in TNC 13 years ago, I am working more deeply in the Amazon region.
I'll kick it off and say that, in episode 1 of our series, we spoke with Paola Caballero and Marcio Stuchman talking about COP30, talking about Brazil as a host country for COP30. But one of the kind of segments in that conversation we talked about was, the importance of indigenous peoples in conservation. And I think Paola did a great job of kind of explaining that. But I will ask Catalina for you to kind of kick us off here and just talk about, the vital role indigenous peoples play in forest stewardship. The stat that I have down that I read in an article is, indigenous peoples hold 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So this is a huge thing. I know we're going to be talking about financing, throughout this conversation. How do we finance indigenous peoples? But first things first, can you give us a little bit of information on, this vital role that indigenous peoples play in forest stewardship?
Okay, thank you. As a Colombian biologist working in the Amazon, I've seen firsthand how indigenous people are the true guardians of biodiversity. Globally, they protect nearly 80%, as you said, of remaining biodiversity. For the Colombian Amazon, are nearly the 58% of forests that they protect. It's a that information is a well-known fact in conservation cycles, but not widely understood by the public. Indigenous people protect indigenous people protect not only the biodiversity, but these communities are literally holding the deforestation line. They are protecting from biodiversity loss, climate collapse. It's not just about the land. It's about their territories. It's about their knowledge systems. Though through their knowledge systems, their culture, the role of each member of the community, including elders, women, child, everyone play a fundamental role in the conservation of territories. In Colombia, indigenous territories act as ecological buffers against deforestation and resource extraction. The IP, the indigenous people, don't see the territory divided in forests, water, lagoons. They see one territory. They see it as a whole that they depend on and use and manage and as a conservation strategy. As several indigenous elders have said, the jungle without indigenous people is not a jungle, and indigenous people without the jungle are not indigenous people.
So on that note, we talked about, financing a little bit earlier and how we're going to focus on that, but it seems like there's this significant funding gap. The note that I have down in Brazil, less than 1% of official development assistance for climate action supports indigenous-led forests or land tenure efforts. So we understand how important indigenous people are to forest stewardship, but it looks like there's this big funding gap. There's a funding gap of how we're actually providing them financing and funding to actually do the work that they're great at, right? It's being stewards of this land. So could you talk a little bit about that funding gap and what that means for indigenous people?
Okay. Despite these essential roles that we have talked, indigenous organizations continue to receive less than 1% of climate-related development funding. This happened not only in Brazil, but in Colombia, and in other places. If we think about that, the people doing the most with the least. According to the above, in the case of Colombian Amazon, approximately 58% of the forests are protected by the indigenous people. 1% with versus 58%. And if we are not funding indigenous-led conservation, we are missing one of the most cost-effective, resilient, and culturally grounded climate solutions that we have. Our work with indigenous communities in Colombia has shown that when communities are given direct support, technical and financial, they can lead restoration, protect sacred watersheds, monitor forest carbon, monitor biodiversity, and protect using and managing the incredible biodiversity that they are protecting in the area.
And then, Fernanda, I'll kind of throw it to you for a second for more of a policy lens. Another note that I have down that I actually read this morning, I think it was an article that was released by Paula Caballero and someone else, maybe in 2024, maybe around September. In that article, it said that governments worldwide drive more than $7 trillion in direct and indirect subsidies to fossil fuels, agriculture, and fisheries, 8% of global GDP, and more than 10 times the global biodiversity financing gap, when agriculture subsidies alone are responsible for 14% of global deforestation. So all that being said, to kick it over to you, I'd just ask, how can we reform the $7 trillion in annual subsidies that drive deforestation and that are harming indigenous territories?
Well, Preston, thank you for the question, but this is the $1 million question. This is a huge discussion that we have been doing, not just with the Brazilian government, but also in the UN conventions on how to stop the perverse subsidies, how to stop the subsides for deforestation, for the agriculture that's been deforesting these areas, or even fossil fuels, or even we are providing subsidies for increase the conflicts among indigenous lands. So we really need a reform of the financial mechanisms, and especially to unlock the financial mechanisms so we can really have this flow going directly to indigenous peoples. We have lots of, as Carol was mentioning, we have lots of data that can prove that indigenous territories are the most protective, effective, not just for biodiversity, but also for deforestation and also for the traditional knowledge. There are lots of knowledge inside these territories that should be being protected. Knowledge for how to manage the forest, how to manage fire, how to manage lots of diseases. We are losing with these lots of conflicts and deforestation around these territories. We are losing it. So we really need reform of the financial mechanisms, and we need to start this by providing space for these indigenous leaders to participate in these discussions. We cannot have the discussion on how to um, increase the financial flow if we don't have them participating in the table of the discussions. So this is one of the things that we have been working also on TNC on to elevate the presence of these leaders in the climate conferences and other spaces as well, that they are discussing on how to increase the resources, the financial flows that goes to climate and biodiversity.
So kind of, piggybacking off of that, this concept and what we'll be kind of focusing on of direct funding to indigenous peoples. Galo, I'll ask you this question, to just talk about the concept of direct funding, why it's essential to support indigenous-led conservation.
Yeah, this direct financing are systems that allow indigenous communities to access and manage economic resources autonomously, to design and implement projects that respond to their priorities, ambitions, and sustainable development. But as Fer mentioned, there are not a very strong initiative to consolidate this directed financing. Financing have difficult, as for example the bureaucracy, the intermediaries that can affect and don't allow the indigenous can use the money in the way that they consider is the good way. Groups like the OPIAC, the OPIAC is the National Organization of Indigenous People from the Colombian Amazon, and COICA, that is a regional, is that the Pan-Amazonian level organization, have been very clear. indigenous people are not just beneficiaries. They are leaders, they are partners, they are climate actors in their own rights. And they have different tools that they are developing to ensure that the money that they invest in their territories have not only the traditional vision, but are aligned to their knowledge system and ensure that they can achieve their goals as indigenous people. Um, as we approach COP30 in Belém, we need to push for financial architectures that recognize this. That includes rethinking how donors assess risk, how national governments structure partnerships, and how multilateral funds like the GCF can be more accessible to grassroots-led initiatives. But not only giving the money, but facilitate the opportunities, the procedures to access. Sometimes the procedures are very difficult for the indigenous organization. For example, some of the funds requires experience in finance manage, but if they don't have the opportunity to start, they never will have the opportunity to access to that funds.
Throughout this conversation that we've had with Fernanda and Catalina, we've understood, some of the financing challenges Indigenous peoples and communities face, in accessing climate funds. And I'm excited to have you on to talk specifically about Ecuador too, and just what you've seen and some of the experiences you've had. But what I really want to do is bring into focus with Ecuador's Amazon Biocorridor program. The note that I have down is, this program was co-designed with Indigenous peoples and nationalities and will improve the management of existing protected areas, establish new protections for land, rivers, and wetlands, support human well-being, and use strategies guided by local knowledge and scientific evidence to enhance ecological connectivity and resilience. I would just ask, could you talk about this program, how it was put into place, and then what are some of the let's say successes that have come ever since this biocorridor program was put into place?
Yeah, thank you, Preston. Let me give you a little bit of context about the Amazon region in Ecuador, for example. The Amazon region in Ecuador means something like 50% of the country. Yeah, in this 50% of the country is located the best biodiversity of the country. The green part of Ecuador, the most green part of Ecuador, is located in the Amazon region. So very rich in terms of biodiversity, but in addition, it's very rich in terms of culture because 11 nationalities are located in the Amazon region. And in addition to that, 60% of the Amazon region is owned by the indigenous communities. And in addition to this, the source of income, the main source of income of the country comes from the Amazon, which is oil exploitation, and in these years, mining exploitation. So that is the context of the Amazon region. TNC is working in Ecuador more than 50 years. We are international cooperation in Ecuador, so we are aligned with national priorities. We're looking for the strengthening capacities of our stakeholders, of our key actors, of key partners. We are looking for the institutionalization of our work. And in addition, we are trying to harmonize our work with other organizations like us. So we have a very close relationship with the government and specifically with the Ministry of Environment. Why I am telling this because at the beginning of 2022, we received a request of technical assistance from the Nature Conservancy of the government of Ecuador, the Ministry of Environment, Water and Ecological Transition. They asked us if we can develop a conservation program together with the government, of course, in order to conserve biodiversity in the Amazon region. In addition, they asked two things. Try to focus in terrestrial ecosystems, but also in freshwater ecosystems. So this Biocorredor Amazónico is very important because of that. But in addition, the request of the government was to work together with the indigenous communities. So that's the origin of this program called Biocorredor Amazónico, which is owned by the government of Ecuador, but it's owned by the society of Ecuador. And we began to work in defining a strong portfolio of conservation of the Amazon region. As you said, we have some conservation goals agreed with the government and with other actors in the country, but we were working in specific activities with the 11 nationalities of indigenous nationalities in the country. So we co-design. We are always saying that we co-design this program together with indigenous communities in order to get not only the occidental, the Western knowledge, the scientific knowledge, but also the traditional knowledge that is located in the Amazon region of Ecuador. So this program, the Biocorredor Amazónico, has this specific characteristic. Is not we didn't arrive to the Amazon to share with them what we think we have to do in the Amazon region, but we together co-create this program in order to assure conservation measures, but in addition to accomplish the requirements and necessities of indigenous communities.
Galo, I'll tell you what's interesting and what I found throughout this whole series that, we've done with the Nature Conservancy and, it's 6 episodes. And, the word that I keep coming back to on all these episodes is collaboration. And in this example, you're talking about collaborating with indigenous communities, Nature Conservancy as an NGO, and then with an actual government to kind of make a program work and a program happen. And you're co-designing this with all these different kind of people and groups. So I think one of the big takeaways that I've had from the series is just that how critical collaboration is. And I think that's evident in this program as well.
Of course, Preston, our work, let me give you this information. We are an international organization. We have more than 70 years working in the world. We are located in the US, but we have worked in 80 countries. But in those countries, specifically in Ecuador, we are international corporation. So we have to be aligned with the government and the society of Ecuador. So that's what we are doing. And in addition, for example, the Ecuadorian program is the team is 35 people now. All of us, we are Ecuadorians. So we are always saying that we have an international hat, an Ecuadorian hat, in order to implement our work. And the interaction with Ecuador is in both ways. We are trying to bring all the good examples of conservation in other parts of the world, and in addition, we have to bring to the world all the examples we have of conservation in Ecuador. One very good example is, for example, the water funds. I don't know if you know about water funds. So the first water fund in the world was established here in Quito, the capital city of Ecuador, 25 years ago. And since then, we, as an international organization, take this example of Ecuador and try to apply to other parts of the world. The example, of course, every watershed is different, every situation is different, but we shared what we were doing in Ecuador 25 years ago. So we are doing the same in every project we are implementing. And in this case, in the Amazon region, in the Biocorredor Amazónico, we are doing exactly like that. So it's not only collaboration, cooperation between local stakeholders, local actors of the society, but in addition, because of the complexity of the transaction involving this debt swap transaction, we have a lot of cooperation with other stakeholders outside Ecuador. And we were trying to, as TNC, working in Ecuador more than 30 years, we had this specific activity to link the capacities of Ecuador with the capacities of other parts of the world. And we were doing that.
Yeah. I mean, so on that note, I think you mentioned it a few times, but this very large, nature bonds, green bonds, whatever you call it, project that's kind of underway in Ecuador. I mean, this was a massive project. what I have down is the largest to date nature bonds project, and it's expected to provide sustainable financing, approximately 460 million US dollars over 17 years, and technical support for the Amazon Biocorridor program. Could you speak on this a little bit and maybe provide us and provide the listeners with an overview about what a nature bond even is and how it's actually facilitated?
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about the Biocorredor Amazónico. The Biocorredor Amazónico is a management model. We are trying to have all the best practices regarding conservation of terrestrial ecosystems, of freshwater ecosystems, bioeconomy, sustainable management of natural resources, the involvement of local communities in this huge program. As you said, the Biocorredor Amazónico is going to invest 416 million in the next 17 years, which is a lot of money. Is the most the biggest transaction of this kind in the world, and is the biggest one, and is the first one. I'm sorry, located in terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. So that's the whole context. But we have to compare this with what's going on before the Biocorredor Amazónico. For example, the Ministry of Environment is investing something like 13 million per year in the conservation of the Amazon region regarding to protected areas and everything. So that's what our government is investing. Of course, there are other organizations, private organizations that are investing in addition to those resources. But if you want to understand just one specific fact regarding the conservation of biodiversity in the Amazon of Ecuador is this. If you want to have an adequate, a good management of protected areas in the Amazon region, protected areas that are already protected, you should need something like, depending of the analysis, $16 to $33 million per year, and we are investing for the whole work regarding environment just 13 million per year. That's one fact. The other fact is that the Biocorredor in the next 17 years is going to invest something like 23 millions per year in the Amazon. Those 23 millions is 4.5 millions in an endowment, which is not going to be touched until 17 years. But we are going to invest something like 17, 18 millions per year each year. So if you need to have a good management of the already protected areas, you need 16 to 33 millions. And the Biocorredor is going to invest in not only in conservation of protected areas, but in restoration, in conservation of rivers, in bioeconomy, in many other conservation agreements that we have with the government of Ecuador. Is just a small amount of resources. Is a full amount of resources, very important. We have a challenge in order to invest those resources in the best way possible, but at the same time, these resources are very good, but they are one part of some other resources that we need in order to conserve and manage in the best way the Amazon region of Ecuador. So that's something we are always sharing with people. In addition, well, the transaction is allowed to have this money. This money is assured. We are going to have this money in the next 17 years. But at the same time, we support the establishment of a conservation trust fund. This conservation trust fund has the challenge, as I said before, to manage those resources. How to invest those resources in the best way in order, first, to include the main stakeholders of the Amazon region in order to accomplish the conservation commitments that the Biocorredor has, And in this case, for example, is the involvement, as you said at the beginning, the direct involvement of indigenous communities. Remember this fact: 60% of the Amazon region of Ecuador is owned by indigenous communities. So this program is looking for that. This Biocorredor Amazónico is looking for the good involvement of indigenous communities. And in order to do that, this Conservation Trust Fund is having a board. In this board is formed by 9 people. 3 people from the government of Ecuador, from the Ministry of Environment, which is the National Environmental Authority in Ecuador, the Ministry of External Affairs, because this is an international transaction involved not only Ecuadorian but also other international stakeholders like IDB, like DFC, like Bank of America at the beginning. And in addition, the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Production. They are going to share every cycle of representativeness. They are going to share that. And the Conservation Trust Fund is also formed by 6 people from the private sector. From those 6 people, one is TNC as part of the transaction, and myself as director of TNC, I am part of the board. But in addition, we have 5 people. One from the indigenous communities, one representative from indigenous communities, another one from academia, another one for international cooperation working in Ecuador, one in addition for members of the society, of the non-governmental society working in the Amazon in conservation issues or productive issues, and one member of the financial sector of Ecuador. So this is the board of the Biocorredor Amazónico that has the challenge to manage those resources, to invest in the best way possible, and we have all the standards, international standards, in order to assure that the funds are very well invested, that they are a very good use of the resources, and principally 2 things. One, the involvement of indigenous and local communities of the Amazon, and the second one, the accomplishment of the conservation commitments that this transaction has.
Yeah, and then on that note too, again, through research, what I saw was, last year in 2024, the Nature Conservancy, they led a workshop with indigenous groups from Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. What was kind of discussed at this workshop? What were the objectives? And was there any successes that came out of that workshop, from this workshop again in 2024 with indigenous groups?
Yeah, this workshop was a first approach with national indigenous organization of the Amazon, of different countries of the Amazon, to begin identifying the main gaps regarding the construction of financial mechanisms that will be directed towards indigenous people. This was done with national indigenous organizations, where the context of each country was identified and recognized in relation to the conditions that enable direct mechanisms for indigenous people. Specific guidelines for construction were also identified, as well as specific recommendations by each country. And for the Colombian case, we have been working with the PIAC, thinking and looking for options. We have invited another partners like BID, learning with another experiences like the experiences from Brazil, to try to design and to propose a specific tool that could be used for the Colombian indigenous people.
And then, Fernanda, I'll throw a question to you right now, because in the beginning, we talk about, that $7 trillion, I think it was $7 trillion was the number of, these subsidies that are kind of fueling deforestation and all of these things. And this question might be complex. So if you don't have a clear answer, that's okay. But I would just ask, as a global community, I think we look at indigenous peoples to lead conservation. But we ask them to do this while global systems still obstruct their sovereignty and livelihoods. So I would ask, and again, it's kind of complex, but why does the global community still ask indigenous people to lead conservation when we aren't providing them the things that they need to actually be successful. And a lot of times we're obstructing their progress.
Yes, indeed, Preston. It's a very complex question. But I don't know, maybe I'm going deeply in the reflection, but I think the issue is that we still don't, as a society as a whole, we still don't recognize the governance of indigenous peoples. The way they are managed the territory, the collective governance, the way they see the integration of nature and their surveillance. We don't, and when I say we don't recognize it, as we don't do it the same as we do for us. We live in a completely different way of life, and we take the role for indigenous peoples and local communities, the role of the conservations, because they do it historically with the way of lives. So we think we have to change our mindset and recognizing it and recognizing by changing, supporting the changing of the multilateral banks, the multilateral spaces of governance, giving them much more power in these spaces, like in the climate conference, for example. As they are not recognized as nations, there are parties, they cannot be part of the discussions, parts of the negotiation. They shall first negotiate it inside their country, and the countries should take their voices or their demands. One thing that should be done, as they should be considered as parties, so they can have votation, they will be listened, and they will be part of this change. This is one of the example of things that we should be fighting for. Like, so they can have, they can be in this, they can be in these places, and not just for being there, but just to having the same power as nations have, as parties have, so they can support this change, this transformation. It's not us that should change for them, but to give space, to elevate their voices, to give tools so they can change that, not change it, then can show us the correct way of living, the correct way of managing the land, the correct way of living with this ecosystem. The Brazil National Organization of Indigenous Peoples, APIB, and also COIAB, that is the Indigenous Coordination of the Coordination of Indigenous Organizations of Brazilian Amazon. They have a campaign for COP30 that is, the answer is us. Like, they have the answers for the financial mechanisms, for mitigation climate change, for adaptation, for including the traditional knowledge. So we should listen to us, not listen, but giving them the space for taking the decisions and the power for this.
And then on that note on finance mechanisms, from what I've seen, again through research, through working with other kind of organizations and groups, funding through jurisdictional, the Red Plus programs is something that organizations kind of go to. It's becoming more and more prominent. And the note that I have down is, Red Plus is an acronym, but it stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. Could you explain to the audience about what Red Plus, the acronym, is, and its importance to climate financing?
Sure, Preston. I'll try to make it very summarized because it's a very long history. This strategy, this acronym, was created in the UNFCCC, the convention, the UN Climate Convention. It was a first idea, first proposal brought by the civil society from Brazil, together with other Latin American countries, to bring the deforestation as a discussion for climate change. Because in the beginning, when the climate conference was created, the deforestation was not discussed. It was not part of the discussions as one of the main causes of the climate change. And it in Brazil, one of the six most polluters because of deforestation, and it was not discussed in the conference. So these specialists, these researchers brought the discussions there as a way, like, to benefit people who are preventing for the deforestation to happen. So it's a way to make that, like, specifically countries, not just individuals, but countries could create programs to show that they were reducing deforestation. So first it was just 1D, it was just the reduction emissions from deforestation. Then they saw no, the degradation, the forest degradation is also huge, has a huge problem for climate change as well. And then they included the plus, that is also to benefit people who are preventing. It was working to maintain the carbon storage in the forest, to maintain the biodiversity, all the ecosystem service. And since the beginning, indigenous peoples from Amazon basin participate in these discussions. Red Plus was also one way, one concept to bring more indigenous peoples to discuss, to participate in the climate conference and to show their role. Because COICA, as Carol told us, is the organizations that represent is the main organization that represent the indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin. It was part of these discussions, and they told if you are discussing how to reduce deforestation, we indigenous people should be in the center of these discussions. And they also created the Red Indigenous the Amazon Red Indigenous. It was a kind of mechanism, it was a kind of narrative to bring indigenous as the center of these discussions as well. So they in the UNFCCC they discussed the safeguards, mechanisms for sharing the benefits for RED, because as it was a mechanism that countries should receive payment for the deforestation that they were reducing. So if they were receiving payment, indigenous people should be part of this beneficiary, because they are like preventing the deforestation to happen in these areas, to prevent, to secure the deforestation, not just maintaining the carbon storage in the forests, but also preventing the deforestation to increase. So it was one of the concepts in the UNFCCC that brought indigenous to the discussions. So they discussed the benefit sharing, the safeguards, like, okay, if you are having a Red Plus program in the country, you should show that you are respecting all the indigenous people's rights, like the rights to territories, how to reduce the conflict, how they were participating in the discussions. So it was a concept that starts in the UNFCCC in the 2005, and now like 2 decades ago we already saw some countries receiving payments, some subnational governments receiving payments. I think we will discuss about it, but Brazil has a case on how these mechanisms went directly to a an indigenous fund, so indigenous peoples accesses directly funds from red. So I think there's lots of still issues and conflicts regarding red, but I think that during these years we are able to make progress to for the involvement of indigenous peoples and how they can participate on this.
So I did want to highlight real quick. You'd mentioned earlier about this kind of case study that we'd look into in Brazil with a RED program, and I have that down as the. And correct me if I pronounce this wrong, but the Mato Grosso's RED Plus program. TNC, partnered with other organizations on this, and it sounds like, it really provided funding that was needed for indigenous groups, indigenous peoples. So could you highlight, what that RED program was, how it came about, and then what were some of the lessons learned and successes from that specific program?
No, sure, Presto. It is very interesting because I participated in the beginning of the creation of this program. I was not at TNC yet, but I was already working with indigenous organizations, so I could be able to join some workshops that created this program in Mato Grosso. Mato Grosso, just to bring a context, Mato Grosso, it's Brazil. It's one of I think it's the second, the first, state with the most deforestation rates in Brazil. It's in the middle of Brazil, between Amazon and Cerrado biome, and it's the second state of cattle production. So it has lots of agro production here, but it has also lots of indigenous territories. That is where the most forests are protected there. And TNC was working together with the Mato Grosso state government to create the Red Plus strategy in the state, and also with the indigenous organizations of the state, that is FEPOINT. It's the federal, I don't remember all the acronym, but it's the federal organizations that represent the indigenous peoples of Mato Grosso. they were participated in all the creation of the RED program, and they elaborated how the indigenous head sub program should be, like how they should be consulted, how the financial resource should be shared with them. So they created lots of publications regarding their territories, regarding their way of living in Mato Grosso. And it was one of the first time in history that we had like the Mato Grosso government discussing with the indigenous peoples from the state. So was one of the huge lessons. Like we have to put these people to discuss together about this program. We cannot discuss just with the government or just with the indigenous group. They should discuss together about all the challenges. And one of the bigger lessons learned we have Amazon region in Brazilian Amazon here had the indigenous created a fund, the Podal Indigenous Fund. It was the first indigenous fund created in Latin America, and it was created in 2018. It has been discussing among the indigenous from Amazon region since 2011, but just in 2018 it was established. And from Mato Grosso region, there was a specifically indigenous group, the Chavante, that TNC works closely to them for the management of the territory, capacity building, and other activities. And they said, no, we want to access this mechanism, these the resources from RED, from the Podali Fund, because even from a RED program from the state, the resources didn't go directly to indigenous peoples. They should access to a financial institute, so they should provide the reports. They should provide the technical capacity to manage these resources. So they said, no, we wanna manage this, we wanna access this to this indigenous fund. So TNC supported all the technical capacities. So the funds went to the Podali Fund, and then Chavante Group assessed the resources to Podali Fund. So Podali was the institution that was responsible to show the reports, to show to the financial institute how the Chavante was implementing the project. And it was the first experience here in Brazil on how climate finance mechanism could go directly to an indigenous fund that it would go directly to activities in the ground. So it was very successful, and it was not a huge amount of money. We are not talking about millions and millions, because the resource that they needed was to implement local activities, and most of the time they're not so high the numbers. So, but it was very positive to see how we can use a mechanism that is led by indigenous groups, that has an indigenous governance, that has an indigenous directions on how they access the climate mechanism, a climate finance mechanism, and it could go directly to the indigenous. So it was very positive.
So one thing I want to highlight there is this aspect of free, prior, and informed consent. I have down that it's a specific right that protects the interests of indigenous peoples and local communities, ensuring they have the right to give or withhold their consent for any activity that may affect their lands, territories, or resources. With this specific RED Plus program, in Brazil, can you talk about the importance of, free, prior, and informed consent when working with the indigenous groups as well as the government? Because as I can expect, it's probably a little bit complex when you have all these different stakeholders involved in a financial mechanism.
The FPIC, the prior informed consent, it was one of the most important safeguards that was decided inside the climate conventions discussions when we were elaborating the RED concept. So indigenous peoples working hard to have the safeguards there. So any project, any program, any money that the state, the subnational or national government receive, that can indigenous people shall be involved, or any program that is elaborated, indigenous people shall be involved. And it's very important, but it's also a huge challenge when we are talking about indigenous territories in Brazil. Like just in Amazon, in Amazon region, they represent 1/3 of Amazon region. we are talking about huge areas of size of countries. The logistic aspects is very difficult. So to consult these groups are very difficult. But it's a challenge that the governments and also the indigenous organizations shall face. Like they are aware of their rights, they are aware of the FPIC, so they are also supporting government to tell them how to reach them. They have the consultation protocols, like lots of organizations, they elaborated their consultation protocols that are like public, that are guidelines to say to you how to consult the organization. What are the aspects, when to consult, or how to respect that, how to implement these rights. So not just the government, but also the indigenous organizations, the indigenous groups are doing their role, are doing their part on to how to have the best FPIC, how to have the best discussions to implement this program.
So, final question I'll ask. Obviously, this series is called The Road to COP30. We're speaking on a variety of topics, but this episode specifically, we're talking about providing direct access to climate financing to Indigenous peoples. So as we approach COP30, and as hundreds of thousands of people are going to come to Brazil to convene to try to move the global climate agenda forward, I would just ask, what do both of you hope is talked about, what is discussed, what is accomplished, around Indigenous groups at this marquee climate event in Brazil this year?
Well, it's been very interesting because like I'm in the eye of the hurricane regarding COP30, and it's happening here in Brazil. I live here. And it's been very interesting because at the same time, for the first time in history, we have an indigenous ministry. So for the first time in history, we have like an indigenous leader being part of the organization of COP, organization of the agenda. So she's aware of what is needed to be there. So we are having like lots of discussions and guidelines to have like a huge indigenous participation, specifically from Amazon region in this COP. And we hope that all the reports that being prepared, all the decisions consider the indigenous groups in their decisions. We had the indigenous leaders participate at COP since the beginning of the early of 2000. But just in 2015, with the Paris Agreement, they have like a platform established, and they recognize to have to increase the participations and the recognition of indigenous peoples in the COPs. So we hope that this recognition is not just in the papers, not just in the documents, but it's also in the taking of the decisions. Specifically this year that we have to deliver COP, the government has to deliver the roadmap to $1 trillion for the climate finance. We hope to see the rights of indigenous peoples to direct access to these mechanisms.
Thank you for that question, Preston. I think it's a very important one. We are looking, as I said, we are as an international, we TNC as an international organization, but I should say that we as an environmental society of Ecuador, we are looking for the best way to conserve the biodiversity, conserve the natural resources and the ecosystem services that the Amazon and our country provides. And we are looking also with the good and the better involvement of local communities. And when I am saying that, I am saying also people like us, people like live in the cities, in other parts of the world, because we all of the country. I'm sorry, because we are all benefit from those activities. So we are looking for, and we as part of the Biocorridor Amazónico, we are looking of the best involvement of local communities possible, and we are in that process. As I said, the co-creation of the program was one. The inclusion of one member of the indigenous communities as part of the board is another one, and the inclusion of other stakeholders of the working and living in the Amazon region is another one. And in addition, we are, as I said, the challenge that we are facing that is to demonstrate that this transaction, that this innovative financial mechanism to conserve biodiversity and to include indigenous communities in Ecuador is going to work. That is our challenge. And we are looking for that. So we expect that local and indigenous communities by themselves in agreement with other stakeholders of the society could apply to those resources. We are looking for that. We are specifically working for that. We want that they are very well, they feel very well um, represented by the work we are doing in the Biocorredor Amazónico. And I should say that that's the main goal that we are looking for, Preston, in this Biocorredor Amazónico. And in addition, I should say, in every program that or my organization, but many other organizations working in Ecuador are looking for.